Okay. Yeah, we're on now. So today, could you, thanks. Today is May 28th, 2014. My name is Jason Ross, and this is the sixth in a series of 8 classes and discussions on Lyndon LaRouche's economics textbook called So, You Wish to Learn All About Economics. The book itself can be found as a PDF in the video description. And today's chapter is going to be on wages and population. First, though, we're going to talk about some of the responses to last week's homework, which were very fun. So, those of you who didn't see last week's homework or don't know what I'm referring to, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you go to the playlist this video is a part of, you'll find the previous class there, and that homework is in the video description. So, the first of the homework questions was about making decisions about how to allocate credit for an economic recovery. And the question had a number of different proposals of whether things were creditworthy or not, and people had some funny answers about that. What was really good was, somebody here. There you go. What was really good is one of the responses took it from the top and talked about, what are the objectives, what are the economic objectives, just to make that clear, to then put in context the decisions to be made about credit. So, here is, please mute yourself. So here's one of the answers. Considering the standards given by Lynn in Chapter 7, as in the context of the current strategic conception, one can create basic rules by which to gauge these various investments. Here are mine. 1. In response to American Apparel's request, a large raspberry, that is a Bronx cheer, should be blown by relevant government officials. This was American Apparel asking for government credit to expand their production of shitty clothes. The U.S. government should not extend credit towards consumer goods production except in exigent circumstances. Right. 2. Mankind must prioritize advances in EFD towards thermonuclear fusion development, allowing mankind to develop energy capabilities of even greater intensity than the sun. Can Anastasia is saying she can't hear me. Can somebody nod if you can hear okay? Okay. So, yeah, that's working fine. We should maximize the collaboration between the Eurasian nations and the U.S., a process which will complete the strategic extinction of the British Empire, and technologically we have to play leapfrog. Solving problems with existing, already done that solutions is a serious strategic mistake. So from that standpoint, the different parts of the credit allocation included things like Haas automation, doubling its factory size to produce more machine tools, which would definitely be something that we would want to do. It creates capital goods, which is one of the criteria, and specifically creating machine tools, which are the highest level of capital goods. They're the goods that then produce everything else in the economy. So improvements there mean everything that's produced with them potentially could be improved as well. So that is a huge, it's very upstream investment. Also on science programs, in the list included a $3.6 trillion request from the American Society of Civil Engineers over 10 years to rebuild our infrastructure. And that's not to rebuild our infrastructure to have maglev rail or anything. That's to rebuild our infrastructure to basically put it in repair. In comparison with that, the American broadband effort, I forget its exact name now, but the FCC wants to give broadband to everybody. They want $10 to $20 billion to accomplish that. And then way below these, it would take $40 million to finance MIT's Alcator project to work on fusion. And it would take $200 million to put together the stellarator that Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory has constructed but not assembled and started to use yet. So, one of the things is seeing how small the costs are for these fusion investments makes it really clear how fusion has been suppressed, that it's not accidental. So there's a couple things to say about that. I really am this time going to put a collection of the responses also in this homework description, in the video description, so you can see what some of the answers were. The second question was about the gold standard and a gold reserve system. And so this had some, I'm going to read a couple of these answers. They were very good answers. Here's one. The difference between a gold reserve system and a gold standard system is your nation's ability to be sovereign. If you don't have control of your economic value, then you really don't have any purpose for government. This comes up with people like Ron Paul, who want to go to a gold standard. They even say things like, we can't base our money on something arbitrary. We must give it physical value. Gold. Your money is then entirely, I should say arbitrarily, based on the value of gold in the markets. Not on intention, not on production, let alone progress. Your country is then left to the whims of the marketplace, which of course the British Empire loves because they can come in and manipulate your currency, buy you up, then throw you away. So yeah, Ron Paul is a good example of that. Some of the other answers, people generally did a good job with this one. That in a gold standard, you're arbitrarily limiting your economy to the amount of this metal that you have, and in a whoever has the most gold wins. One of the answers. Another important point about the gold reserve system is that not only is it possible to create credit, in other words, contrasting it to the gold standard is important, but also what makes it different from today. And that major difference is that the currencies don't float. So, in 1971, this development that Lyndon LaRouche had forecast when the Bretton Woods system collapsed and the fixed exchange rates between currencies and they're being pegged to gold, when that broke apart, currencies were then like any other stock or any other commodity. The value of a currency itself could actually change. So when you've got a system where currencies just exist on the markets, you've got the easy potential, if you have a lot of monetary control, to exert huge political control, to destroy a nation's currency, make it go way up, make it go way down, and in general force people to be more involved with gambling, because all the uncertainty about interest rates means that there's a Wall Street firm that would be happy to sell you insurance against interest rate changes. So that's the other aspect that no one had talked about explicitly, but it's very important compared to today about a gold reserve system. And then the third question, let me read a couple of these too, called for everyone to find a new to them evil quote from either Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, or David Hume. So these quotes were all so evil, I'm going to go ahead and read them. So let's start with this one here. I got, I'm going to close the email. Let me open it up again. Here it is. So here is David Hume from his A Treatise on Human Nature from 1739. He says that, quote, reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. So, see here, this person wrote, what's wrong with this statement? Anti-human? Check. Hedonistic? Check. Completely false? Check. Not only does he make the assertion that passion reigns over reason, but he brings it up in the context of being the passions being some sort of master to reason. Evil. That's true. Here's a charming one from Jeremy Bentham from his paper called, maybe the title's enough, it's called In Defense of Usury. Bentham says, among the various species or modifications of liberty, of which on different occasions we have heard so much in England, I do not recollect seeing anything yet offered in behalf of the liberty of making one's own terms in money bargains. In other words, being able to do whatever you want with monetary contracts. From so general and universal a neglect, it is an old notion of mine, as you well know, that this meek and unassuming species of liberty has been suffering much injustice. In other words, anti-usury laws. A fancy has taken me, just now, to trouble you with my reasons, which, if you think them capable of answering any good purpose, you may forward to the press, or in the other case, what will give you less trouble, to the fire. In a word, the proposition I have been accustomed to lay down to myself on this subject is the following one, namely, that no man of ripe years and sound mind, acting freely and with his eyes open, ought to be hindered, with a view to his advantage, from making such bargain, in the way of obtaining money, as he thinks fit, nor, what is a necessary consequence, anybody hindered from supplying him upon any terms he thinks proper to accede to. In other words, if you want to make an agreement, there should be no reason why you can't enter into any contract that you'd like to. Aren't you, isn't that freedom and liberty? So, this is pretty funny. Here's part of the answer, the response given also. I don't doubt that this played a significant role in the ability to seduce weak-minded Americans to play a role in their evil resistance against the preeminent Leibnizian conception of liberty, understood by the Hamilton, Franklin, Washington leadership of the U.S. and espoused in the Declaration of Independence and expressed by LaRouche in Chapter 7. Here's one more evil quote for you. It's the last one I'll read. There'll be some more in the homework compilation. This is from David Hume's splendid essay called On Suicide. Here's David Hume's charming thought. He says, "But suppose that it is no longer in my power to promote the interest of the public. Suppose that I am a burden to it. Suppose that my life hinders some person from being much more useful to the public. In such cases, my resignation of life must not only be innocent, but laudable. And most people who lie under any temptation to abandon existence are in some such situation. Those who have health or power or authority have commonly better reason to be in humor with the world. If suicide be supposed a crime, it is only cowardice can impel us to it. If it be no crime, both prudence and courage should engage us to rid ourselves at once of existence when it becomes a burden. It is the only way that we can then be useful to society, by setting an example which, if imitated, would preserve to everyone his chance for happiness in life and would effectively free him from all danger of misery." Wow, okay. The person who sent this in adds that this is the same logic used by the Nazis to destroy lives unworthy of life, and the Obama administration healthcare policy. Now, although David Hume is writing this essay about suicide, I think it's rather clear that he's talking about killing you rather than himself. If he believes that you're able to decide that you're a burden, and it were better and laudable that you remove yourself from existence, well, if you're not going to get around to it, maybe somebody else should help society by removing you from existence. So this is, I mean, that's, you know, Nazi euthanasia killing right there. So very good job. Those were excellently evil and terrible examples of British liberal thought. So okay. Let's go ahead to what we're going to talk about this week then. This chapter is called Wages and Population. And if you're thinking about, you know, what do economists think about wages and population, you know, there's some things that might come to mind, like the debate about the minimum wage. Recently, fast food workers had a walkout demanding a higher wage. Labor unions, states that have, you know, labor union laws or the right to work laws. Is it possible to only have free contracts, suspend them, right? Or is that Hume? Anyway, whichever one, you know, that we should be able to engage in anything we want to as a contract. Is it fair for CEOs to be paid tens of millions of dollars while workers are paid minimum wage? So those are the sort of things that come to mind. Some of them are presented in terms of how a whole society should operate. Much of it is thought about piecemeal, about how one individual should relate to their employer, say, that kind of thing. What LaRouche does here with this chapter is look at what do you need to do to maintain and improve the population, what should be the standards for wages and demographics overall in terms of a functioning and developing economy. So in the context of an economy that has an orientation that you actually have a plan for, what is required of the population to make that possible, and what's required of the population to give people lives that are of enduring value. So, you know, the first thing that he goes through, most people watching have read the chapter, is that he divides up the labor force into basic different distinctions. Those who are too young to be working, labor force age, and the retired. And he talks about education, because obviously if people are going to be productive in an economy, at least with more developed ones, or with any developments at all, you need some process of education. And that involves both a plan for education and having an economy that's able to support educating young people that doesn't require them to work for subsistence. But there is a certain level of economy required to make education possible. So it is something that you actually have to consider, especially in less developed economies. You know, Lynn contrasts two ideas of education, and he gets a lot into this, and it's something he's been writing about recently as well, with the paper he's working on right now about his own experience with education. But he contrasts John Dewey, who in part laid out the educational program that Bertrand Russell used for his children, which was a real horror story, and Humboldt. Now, Humboldt's education, this is not like people know who this guy is very well. I want to read a few quotes from Humboldt here on Johann von Humboldt of what he considered, what his thoughts were about how education ought to work. And you can contrast this to today. See what you think about it. So he wrote that, first off, Humboldt saw an incredible importance in understanding how to think, how the mind works, how thoughts are created, how to describe your thoughts, how to impart them to others. And he was really insistent that everybody should get a basic, well-rounded, full education, that people should not be specialized too early or, you know, put on technical tracks too early, that specific education, that should occur in vocational education, but that everybody, he was Minister of Education in the early 1800s for Prussia, but that everybody would get a very broad education. Central to that was language. He wrote in a letter to his wife, "It is only through the study of language that there comes into the soul, out of the source of all thoughts and feelings, the entire expanse of ideas, everything that concerns man, above all and beyond everything else, even beauty and art." He had a major emphasis on Greek, also on Hebrew. Let me read a couple other quotes. He said, "The most ordinary day laborer must have the same fundamental basic education as the most highly educated person, and that every part of the system should be interlocked with every other part." This was his idea about 3 stages of education that he wrote. He said, philosophically, education has only 3 stages: elementary, scholastic, high school, and university education. Elementary education should merely enable the child to understand and express thoughts, to read and write, and merely to overcome the difficulties involved in the major ways of describing things. It is not so much education as it is preparation for education, and it is what makes the latter possible. Therefore, it is really only concerned with linguistic, numerical, and physical relations, and it always remains in the mother language. The purpose of scholastic education is the exercise of the faculties and the acquisition of factual knowledge, without which scientific insight and skill are impossible. It should prepare the young student for both of these, enabling him to collect the material which must always accompany his creative work, and to cultivate his intellectual mechanical powers. He therefore has a twofold concern. First, with learning itself, and second, with learning how to learn. He goes on to say that in the university, you're really not a student, but you are a developing researcher who relies on the faculty to assist you. So, you know, I'm going to add a link to an article on that in the video description, because there's really a lot. It's really good getting into them, but I don't think I want to focus on that a lot right now. Overall, and Lynn has continued this, he's got very strong views on education. He wrote in this book, and this is from 1984, in the textbook, he wrote, "Presently, most of the years of public education today are being wasted by bad curricula, worse textbooks, and terrible lesson plans devised by teachers who are increasingly incompetent to teach." So what should education be like? Is it possible to really go through all the fundamentals today? Has science and knowledge advanced so far that we really don't have time to go through everything? That we really should just teach kids the basics, the answers, the formulas, the results? Well, LaRouche says no, that as we progress, as we learn more, education doesn't have to last forever. Like, we're not going to, you know, in 200 years, we're not going to have 50-year-olds, you know, finally moving out of the house to be, you know, to the dorm to be freshmen in college. He's saying, now look, more people might stay in school longer, but it's not going to be going beyond 25 for anybody. He says that progress in respect to fundamentals simplifies the comprehension of large areas of knowledge, to the effect that advancement of knowledge tends to lessen the educational time required to master subject matters up to a fixed quantity of knowledge. So, if you take, for example, chemistry. Now, before Mendeleev, well, after Mendeleev, chemistry was much easier because Mendeleev had developed a unifying concept. Before that, you had a huge disparity, a huge variety of experiments and observations, none of which was able to really be put together in as comprehensive a way as after Mendeleev. So a chemist, for example, is much simpler after Mendeleev than before, even though more is known. Go back earlier in chemistry. Go back to Lavoisier. Lavoisier clarified so much of chemistry, making clear some of the beginning principles of it so that it wasn't alchemy and just lists of things that would happen when you mix different things together and vague generalizations. It became much more specific, much more principled. So just in those chemical examples, for instance, you can see how more knowledge actually makes education easier. Or take quantum mechanics, take quantum processes. Right now, they're incredibly complicated. It takes a couple of years just to get over the shock of what the observational results even are. It seems so impossible when you start getting into how quantum things work. Without doubt, that will eventually be much simpler in the future. So, I'll jump ahead a bit. He talks about how it is that you have to support the entire population even as they're developing, and you also have to think about what is your expected lifespan. If you're going to have 50% of your population actually working and producing things, that's his goal, 50% operatives. If people are going to be retiring at 65, you've got to have a goal for life expectancy of at least 75 if you really want almost everybody to be able to have a full life's work and retire. So in that context, how do you take care of people? How do you think about healthcare? Lynn's describing, he describes what's happening today, that with the economy actually below break-even, with economic wealth being decreased every year, every generation, instead of augmented, let me read this quote, because it's very prescient. He says, what happens when there are these cutbacks? So one thing, you cut costs twofold. By decreasing payments to retired age segments of the population and accelerating the death rates among those segments. Also, accelerate the death rate among persons below 65 years of age by allotting medical services according to cost-benefit criteria. How much is it worth investing in this sickened person, measured against his tax payments and insurance premium contributions over the remaining number of labor force years? In this sort of unraveling process, what begins as a cut in the birth rate leads towards euthanasia against both the retired age segments and next, the seriously ill in the 50 to 65-year-old segment of the population. Now, we're clearly seeing this today. Think about that cost-benefit approach to healthcare. Is it worth this procedure? Is it worth performing this procedure on this person? What will their life be like afterwards? How long are they expected to live? Are they productive? Do they make a lot of money? It might not be worth it. How much are their insurance premiums? Are they buying good insurance? Are they not? Are we going to recoup the cost of paying for this healthcare for this person? It's become very individual. For this person, does this procedure make sense? And lost is the idea of providing healthcare as a national objective, as part of maintaining your society, your workforce, your population as a whole. In that context, things are very different. Also, And this came up around the whole, when Bush was reinaugurated, he had this big plan to privatize Social Security, and the LaRouche movement was, we were definitely leading up the fight to reverse that. We were going to all of these events about Social Security privatization and pointing out why it was a terrible idea and shutting them down and things like this. But one of the facts of that is that because there was an increase, we had the baby boom, and then because, and Lynn points this out, because of the lack of births, because of the encouragements not to have families, in larger families, in part by reducing the deduction for dependent. When you do your income taxes, basically the government indirectly pays you to have children, or it pays you to support your children. Every kid that you have, that increases the amount of deduction you take, reduces your taxes. So it's sort of like a government. It is an indirect government payment. How big is that deduction? What are your goals for what the birth rate ought to be, for what your population ought to be? Are you taking that into account when setting these numbers? Are you thinking about the need for a growing, expanding population? Once a population starts to decrease and it becomes increasingly old, it also becomes much more difficult to maintain it, a situation that we're in now. So, Lynn says actually, if you got an increasing population, the labor force becomes younger, whereas today, if you're spoken to people in manufacturing, it's getting older. People are actually, part of its competence, people actually know how to do farming and are willing to do it, or willing to work in manufacturing and know how to do it. It's getting older. It should be getting younger. So, yeah, so that's important. Now, the other, I just think the most major point of this chapter, among some of the other specifics, and I think I'd like to have a lot of time just for discussion on this one. Some of the specifics, like 50% of the workforce should be operatives, 5% of the labor force should be in science and research and development. That should be the goal as a nation. He brings up something that we've been discussing in the homeworks and in the classes for a few weeks now. He talks about this example of an auto mechanic. So he asks, and this has come up earlier, what's the value of the work of an auto mechanic doing some, an oil change or something on a car? And Lynn writes, this is on page 162, he says, an auto mechanic performing exactly the same procedure on two automobiles in the same condition contributes more or less economic value to society according to the relative usefulness of the operators and passengers associated with the vehicle. Insofar as the car is used entirely by a pimp, the mechanic's labor has negative economic value, whereas the work done on a car required by a poorly paid but essential unskilled industrial operative and his family is positive in some relatively greater degree, according to the degree of contribution of technological progress, directly or indirectly, by the production process in which that operative is employed, or the future role as operatives, etc., of the pre-school leaving age members of his household. Similarly, the mechanic's work on the vehicle which transports the wealthy official employed in income of financial usury, ground rent, or commodity speculation has a negative economic value, like the case of the pimp belonging to the same category of overhead expense. Everything consumed by households whose income is from usury, prostitution, gambling, and so forth is transformed into negative economic value, such that that portion of the labor consumed in producing such goods is transformed into a negative economic value. So, think about this, and this had come up earlier in the homework on this. The value of your job, it's not even in what your job is. It can't only be located there. I mean, if you're, if you're like making a fusion reactor, okay. But in general, unless you're doing scientific research, you're doing something productive. You know, you're making cars. We need cars. That's useful. It really does depend on who ends up driving that car. What is that car used for? Lynn gives the example of a plumber. He says, you know, plumbing technology hasn't really transformed that much in the past 100 years, or, you know, in quite some time. But if that plumber is doing plumbing at a laboratory that's doing incredible work, then his work becomes more useful. If he's doing the plumbing for the bathrooms at a 14-screen movie theater, he might be doing the exact same job, using the same technology, the same tools, but the value of his work, of course, depends on its value. What's it actually doing? What's it accomplishing? So, you know, there is no such thing, like, you know, no one has, like, there's no, like, safe job in society. You know, oh, you know what, I'd really like to do, you know, I'm really concerned about where the world's going, but I'm doing my part because I'm a fill-in-the-blank doctor, organic farmer, preschool teacher, you know, people can think of some other seemingly unattackable, unassailable professions, you know, special ed instructor, I don't know, you know. But you can't get outside the fact that, of course, everybody in an economy is in a whole society, in a whole economy. So the value of your work isn't determined by you, except to the extent that your work is changing society, setting the direction that the economy takes. Otherwise, it's really not up to you. Lynn writes on the next page, he says, the activity of every individual person in society has an implicitly calculable universal significance for the present and future of that society as a whole. He ends the paragraph, for better or worse, each and all among us is a person of universal importance. So with these examples of the plumber, he also gives an example of a laser assembly added to some sort of machine tool, something that's used in production where you've replaced one aspect of it with a laser. Maybe it used to have a drill for cutting, and you've replaced that with a laser. Everything else about the machine tool is the same, but by introducing that one added factor, that one added component, you've now changed the value of every part of that machine tool. Maybe it's now much more precise because you're not using a metal drill head whose size changes with heat, or that wears out over time and changes slightly, that moves, that vibrates, it isn't able to have perfectly smooth cuts. It doesn't have the precision of a laser. So in the same way, in an economy as a whole, the value of each person depends on their context. Your value depends on what the whole economy is doing. And that there's no good that subsists outside this process. There's no, you know, sort of eternal list of do's and don'ts that tells you what good is. You ask, are you good? Say, you know, are you sure? How do you know? And what good isn't a simple list. It is that development, and everybody, at least in, you know, if you're not living in a dictatorship, or even then, has the potential to shape that process as a whole, and is implicitly being immoral if they're not. That's everybody's responsibility to ensure that. So, just to lay out some of these basic parameters that Lynn wants to pursue. It says, first off, we need to have 5% of the population in research and development. And the three fields he focuses on are fusion and plasma. Second is directed energy, so lasers, particle beams, SDI-related things also. This book is from '84. And living processes themselves, which, given the increasing prevalence of antibiotic-resistant infections, this is a overdue breakthrough to make, something really fundamentally new on health and on life. He says that operatives should be at 50%, increasingly working on producing capital goods rather than consumer goods, and that your overall wage and taxation policy, you can't do them in abstract. You have to make those decisions based on bringing about your desired demographics. You know, and part of people's wages, part of that overall is culture, the access to culture, the access to museums and things like this. And then his last suggestion is that we make it a point to export capital goods to developing nations. And he says for two reasons. One is that it helps those nations, of course, and the other aspect of it is that the more that we've got those factories going, the more their machinery is going to be upgraded. So that helps focus not only that exports are most useful, but that the fields that produce those exports, those capital goods, are reaping the most rapid benefits from advances in technology. So maybe this chapter seems somewhat straightforward in comparison to others, but I don't really have anything besides that to open things up, but I'd like to see if there's what people thought, if there's questions, discussion. We can talk more about the earlier homework. Any thoughts? Well, I've got one more evil quote that I'd forgotten. This is from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He says, "The division of labor, from which so many advantages are derived, is not originally the effect of any human wisdom, which foresees and intends the general opulence to which it gives occasion. It is necessary, though very slow and gradual, it is a necessary, though very slow and gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, which has in view no such extensive utility. The propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages." So yeah, this division of labor, that's something that commonly comes up in economy. Well, we have division of labor, that's what makes things happen. And he says the propensity in human nature to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. Now, I don't know about you, I don't know how often people feel the propensity to barter or to exchange one thing for another. Anyway, here's what Anastasia wrote about this. She said, "Oh, how do I start on this piece of work?" Well, first of all, the idea of human nature as, quote, "the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange," is completely insane. It gets more drawn out that we do everything not out of benevolence, but self-love. Basically, everyone is a selfish bastard. Well, that might be true for the British oligarchs. That is not true for human beings. The idea that human beings are just greedy, disgusting creatures, not much better than an animal, really attacks the whole idea of a republic and a self-governance. If people are so concerned with themselves that they then couldn't govern themselves, because it would only be about their own pure personal interests, rather they must be governed by the tugging of everyone's self-interest, pure democracy. That's where the idea of the Articles of Confederacy and the Southern Confederacy come from. States' rights. This idea that you just can't trust man's intentions because they are selfish. So you must limit their influence on society by the accumulation of everyone's selfish ideas. We would not have developed this far if it weren't for the intentions of a few individuals which pushed mankind forward. Scientific breakthroughs, technological breakthroughs, cultural breakthroughs in society were always led by a handful of people. That's the idea of the general welfare, and why you must have a guiding principle of a federal government to be conscious of promoting these breakthroughs for society as a whole. Very good. Yeah. One of the things that came up also on the homework, one of the questions about credit was here. It said, in addition to inertial confinement fusion, like NIF, and magnetic confinement, tokamaks, there are many other ideas for fusion. The Reformed Department of Energy, wait, imaginary, in the future, the Reformed Department of Energy, which now only supports the use of solar panels and calculators, which now only supports the use of solar panels in calculators and roadside emergency phones, would like to set up a Bureau of Alternative Fusion Approaches, a BAFA, and fund it at the level of $500 million a year to support a number of smaller experiments with the expectation that many of them will fail and the hopes that a surprising breakthrough will be made. So this one was interesting. One of the responses on this was that we should, instead of having a separate bureau for unusual ideas, we should actually get the fusion community together, figure out whatever they need in terms of funding to make the breakthrough that's necessary, and then give it to them. Sounds like a good idea. Along with a proposal to make it illegal for American Apparel to have advertisements like the ones they currently have in public. And, yes. Well, any thoughts? Did everybody read the chapter?
Not all of it, but I got through maybe about half.
Okay. Okay.
I didn't get around to reading it this week because of all the campaign work.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, well, we might just have a short one this week, and then you'll have some time to finish reading the chapter. Just seems fine. If anybody has anything.
Well, I'll just add that I think it's interesting that this point about the mechanic, the plumber, it's something that people do in the United States. They do know in their bones. I think it's something about what we talk about with the population. When you have people who are, when you say you can actually mass organize the population around these principles, because there are a lot of wonderful people who understand a productive economy, even though they're not necessarily like fusion scientists or machine tool operators. In other words, that people do have a strain of thought where they can conceive of the larger productive system and see their role in it and feel a pride in being a part of that. Like my grandfather was a truck driver for Weber in California, and they would drive. It's an aerospace company, and he would drive their prototypes up and down the California coast. And so, despite the fact that he wasn't highly skilled and involved in actually producing the material, and so forth. He understood what it meant to be a part of the larger mission orientation. So we have people in the United States who think that way, which I think is pretty unique. I bet it's much stronger here than generally across the world, except for the burgeoning Eurasian nations. Like yeah.
And that was one of Roosevelt's explicit statements about some of the jobs programs, especially at first, was that in addition to the value of the work, you get people a sense of self-worth and develop skills, and you have to get started with that. Or the example that Lynn gives from, the grandfather taking his grandchild out to the dam or the whatever it is and saying, I built that. And that's becoming more and more distant as far as like firsthand what people actually have done. But many don't. But it obviously exists as a legacy, as something to grab onto that people remember. It exists in that way.
Well, that's also the living idea that Leibniz was talking about in that first paper you had us read.
Mm-hmm.
What was it?
Oh yeah.
Society and economy.
Society and economy, yeah. Where he says that people would be happy to develop and produce things even if it wasn't out of necessity. That's exactly true. That's exactly what we had in the Roosevelt and also in the John F. Kennedy, in the more recent period.
Mm-hmm.
Rashawn is moving his hands around. Is he trying to talk?
Oh,
no, it's not Rashawn. It's the...
I think he's translating.
yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's a short one this week. So, definitely got time to. If you didn't do the, now you got some time to catch up on homeworks. Make sure you read this chapter. Get started on the next one. For next week, we're going to read both chapters 9 and 10. 9's on basic economic infrastructure, which is it goes in a very interesting direction you might not expect. Obviously, it starts with infrastructure and the incredibly important role that infrastructure plays. This is a point that Lynn made in a paper, I think, in 2005 or 6 called Science, the Power to Prosper, where it was a paper where he talked about outsourcing from a very different standpoint than it usually was addressed. Obviously, just paying people less to do the same work makes more money, but it's not progress just to do the same thing and pay people less. But Lynn made the further point that outsourcing production from a densely developed infrastructure, like the Los Angeles area, and moving it to a less developed infrastructure area, some locations in Asia, for example, even if the factory is operating the same way, even if, as happened many times, all the equipment itself was even moved and reset up, even if the same processes are happening, it's still less productive, because the economic field in which it's operating is less productive. So if it takes more, labor hours to produce the energy, to run the transportation, to provide the water, etc., if all of that is operating under lower energy flux densities and it's less effective, then the production itself becomes much more expensive, much more inefficient. So chapter 9 begins by saying that, that a research team discovered that the closest statistical correlation in economics is between investments in infrastructure and increases in the productivity of labor. That nothing is a better indicator of that relationship than infrastructure. And that's something that I think that's going to end up being a homework also for that chapter. An easy way to do it is to go to the CIA fact book, which we had used that, I forget, in one of the earlier homeworks also, where we were talking about we had compared a couple of different countries like Morocco. We were looking at capital intensity, I think, in different countries. I think was what the example was. But for that one, we can look at the CAA fact book will give you things like miles of road. You can get turned into per capita energy production per capita, railroads per capita, airports per capita, things like that. And you can sort of develop for yourself a picture of the infrastructure density of different nations. And then, even though GDP is, a really lying and made-up number, you can try and use it to compare it in different nations and get a sense of the value of infrastructure. So that'll be coming up on that one. For some homeworks, for some questions for Chapter 8 to think a little bit further, I think the best thing, there's certainly something on education, and then I don't know why. Maybe it's just because I've read this chapter more than others or something. It seemed pretty simple or it seemed pretty simple and powerful, but not too difficult if you work through Chapter 8. So anyway, so for next time we're going to read Chapter 9 and 10. So 9 is infrastructure. It also talks about this point about infrastructure, of course, raises the question of why is the infrastructure so bad then? If it's so obviously tied to economic growth, why would we not, like for example today, why do we not have high-speed rail? Why do we not have fusion power? These things are so obvious. So a major part of that chapter, Lynn talks about the oligarchy. The only way you're going to understand that topic fully is through understanding the fact that an oligarchy has suppressed development. And then Chapter 10 is very short. It's on inflation. So it's a short one. So we'll do both of those together next week. And then the following week, the 8th and final class, we've been pulling together a list of concepts that Lynn's introduced, because this book's 30 years old. So we've pulled together some of the concepts that Lynn has introduced in the 30 years since then, and got some papers to suggest and things like that for what you want to look at more. But that'll be the topic of that class. So
does that mean we'll be graduating?
Yep. At least some people will. Many people have not been doing their homework, and they might have to repeat the class. You know what? Here's the thing. Yeah, summer school, right? Yeah. I mean, the real thing is about making this a repeating process. So like we talked about, getting across the concepts in the book as something like every week you got some new concepts at your disposal to organize your contacts around. I mean, I think in this chapter, the best, just the really pungent two ideas I think from this chapter are the one thing about increasing the power of education, what education should be, and so I'll have that Humboldt article to check out. And then the other thing is this point about about the pimp and the auto mechanic and the plumber, that nobody exists, nothing exists outside of a context. And that to try to take yourself outside of it and say you're doing something that's good or bad based on some list of rules or based on common conceptions of what morality is, or your grandmother thinks you're so nice or something like this, that just doesn't work in the eyes of history. And that everybody exists in universal history. Everybody exists in universal history. They might not think of themselves that way. They might not want to think about that. It can be terrifying to put yourself on that stage, but everybody's on that stage. And so implicitly, everybody has the responsibility of that. So, and then I was sort of just looking over this a couple days ago, was sort of stunned by how you can start with an economic example about increasing the way Lynn does it. He starts by talking about increasing the energy flux density of one aspect of a machine tool. And then he's talking about really like when you've got, take the whole economy, when you've got something new being developed in one aspect of the economy, maybe you're not doing that directly, just like, the motor that positions the laser in the machine tool might not be any different, but its value has still changed. So every part of that machine tool its value changed when the laser was introduced. Similarly, every person in the economy, their value changes when the context of what they're doing changes. So like you take the Apollo program. Lynn talks about people haven't really changed the technology of milk very much recently, or breakfast cereal. But the farmers who are making the milk that's then drunk by the people they're having their breakfast and they're having their bowl of cereal, and then they're sending human beings to the moon and back. Well, they had to have breakfast. So just being a farmer in that society, you're not going to the moon, you're not working at Cape Canaveral, you're not part of that directly, but you still are, because everything is connected. So when you've got a national mission, even people who aren't directly working on the most forefront parts of it, they're still part of that mission. And that's what happened with Roosevelt, for example. I mean, all over the country, what people actually did change through the major works programs. The technologies employed and everything, there was a huge advancement. But even in fields that didn't change that much, what the people did in those fields was still more valuable. And today, people who are doing great work, a fantastic auto mechanic who does a wonderful job fixing cars, he's very efficient, he doesn't overcharge you, he doesn't fix things that aren't broken, and he gets it, them done when they ought to be done and all that. And he works, in Fort Meade fixing the cars of NSA employees who are helping spy on everybody, for example. Or he's working in Manhattan fixing Lamborghinis for, Wall Street employees. It doesn't matter how good a job you're doing. You're still having a negative effect on society. It's probably better if some of these, picking on the NSA too much a little, but it's better if some of these Wall Street guys, it's better if their car breaks down. They're probably going to do something bad at work that day, They're probably, they're going to rip people off, generate money out of nowhere, do something atrocious and terrible. I hope their car breaks down. It might be better. So, you can sort of take pride in doing a job well done if that's your job, but maybe not, So, the only certain way to know that you're valuable, that your life's worthwhile, that you're doing something meaningful with it, is to shape everybody's life, is to shape where the society is going to go. That's the only durable sense of self-worth you can have. Let's say you're a doctor today. You'd love to be a great doctor, but you can't because of the way the insurance companies are telling you to practice. That's why I was reading this article about the record number of doctors who would tell other people, don't become a doctor today. Remember that? What was the statistic? It was like 7 out of 10 or some alarmingly high thing, or like suicides rising among doctors, and just there's a profession that seems like it's hard to pick a more just a decent a teacher, or you're a teacher and you're forced to teach 5-year-olds how to fill in bubbles on a Scantron test. I wish I made that up, but Daniel, well, you didn't make it up, but he told me. So. Anyways, that's a very powerful thing to elaborate for people. Lynn starts at it from economics, and then it becomes an incredibly powerful political message to make with people. So, there's some ammo.
Well, that's an important distinction to make. Is what do these things look like? In the context of an actual national driver mission, and because to kind of, I wasn't involved in anything like what you're talking about with your grandfather, but I know that sense of pride that I got knowing that I was a part of the construction process on a job site for new construction homes for people to live in. Obviously, I wasn't my mind wasn't there, with what I've learned since, being in the organization, but I had a sense that this is required for, people to have, residences, and so even just working on, the trade I was in, which was window installation, I got a sense of that, but what Lynn's elaborating and what you're continuing to make points on is I agree. It's like I didn't know who or what their status was, but also having a strange sense that things just were not what they should be as far as our economy. So, but I can imagine how people would feel if the conditions were just.
Yeah, you can't you can't help but think about, you know, the importance or the value, you know, the value of what you're doing. You know, so, good example. Remember, I had this stupid summer. Well, anyway, tell all the stories about their jobs or whatever. But I had this dumb summer job once where I was at the civil engineering company, and somehow the Navy was told that they should privatize their sewers and their water pipes. I know, like, how do you privatize them? So basically, this is like part of like the Newt Gingrich. This is like a leftover thing of Newt Gingrich, some law that was still being applied or something like that. So basically, the Navy had to figure out how much they thought their sewer pipes and like water pipes were worth, and then put them up for auction to sell the pipes to some company, and then they would pay them a yearly rent to use the sewer and water pipes, with the idea that the private company would manage them better than the Navy would. So totally stupid, right? Complete waste of time. I mean, if they did it, it would have been dumb. But we all knew, everyone at the work, we all knew that this would never happen anyway, because it was such a stupid idea. It's definitely after 9/11, obviously it wouldn't happen, but, you know, it's before that. So it's like every day at work, I'm like, okay, I know I'm doing something that's completely useless. And I can try to think, well, at least I have a job, and that's nice. I'll have some spending money for next year. But, you know, it sucks when you're doing something completely useless every day. You know, so anyway. Okay. All right. Okay, good. Well, read all those things and your homework, and maybe you'll graduate.